The Kennedy assassination in a nutshell is, it was either one lone assassin, in which case it was simply an act of history, an act of God, if you will, tragic as it was, or there was a conspiracy. There's somebody acting along with Oswald, or it was just Oswald and a few friends or something. But there was a conspiracy, okay? And so it's an either or. Either it was a conspiracy or it was not. Now, how do we determine which is the case? Well, all you have to do is look at all the evidence, all right? If it was the lone nut, as the government still likes to claim it was, then it should all be over with, right? Everything that could be known should be known, and it should all be put to bed, and that's the end of it. But no, it's still going on and on and on. So let's look a little closer. There was fabrication of evidence. There was destruction of evidence. There was suppression of evidence. There was alteration of evidence. And there was intimidation of witnesses. The x-rays of the autopsy of President Kennedy are faked. And I'm not saying that, and some conspiracy theorist is not saying that. Gerald Custer, who took the x-rays at the autopsy, says that. He said the ones the National Archives are showing today are not the ones he took. Wow. Floyd Reeve, he's the photographer who took the photographs of the Kennedy autopsy. He said the ones that they're showing us today are not the ones he took. So we have fake x-rays, fake photographs. We've got Kennedy's brain, which could tell us something in a forensics way, is missing.
Right.
Okay? Documents have been altered. Documents are missing. The Secret Service had documents about their protection of President Kennedy and kept them on file until the Assassination Records Review Board is established by Congress to take and make public all files having to do with the assassination, and then the Secret Service destroyed them. Okay? Destruction of evidence. President Johnson, who took over from Kennedy, ordered the car rebuilt before there was any forensic study made of it. In fact, they were washing it down at Parkland Hospital. Okay? Wait a minute. These are all crimes.
The doctors who were at Parkland Hospital, who, were there on the scene when John F. Kennedy was brought there, all of them were interviewed a few years later, and all of them described the exact same wound, an exit wound, a large exit wound on the back right side of his head.
Right.
And every one of them basically said that one of the bullets went through the whole, basically right side of his head from the front to the back, and came out the back of the head. And one of these doctors, in fact, he was so poignant. He said, I really, there was nothing for me to do. Everyone else was doing everything. And I literally was inches away from the president's face. And I saw the most sickening thing I've ever seen in my life, which I saw his brain fall out from his head onto I think it was on the gurney. Mm-hmm. And every one of them said this. And yet then when they were shown the autopsy photographs, which did not show a massive right back of the head rear exit wound.
No, they show a perfectly intact rear skull.
Yeah, and they're all like, this is back, I think they're being interviewed in the 70s, and no one really wanted to say the government's lying. But you could see every one of them was like, no, that's not what I remember it at all.
It wasn't it. That's
and
right.
they wouldn't go any further than that. But that, to me, was very true.
Now you've answered the question. Was there a conspiracy or not? Yes, there was. And since all of these things we're talking about, this was all done at the level of the federal government of the United States. So now that means we had a change of government due to a violent act. What is the dictionary definition of that? Coup d'etat.
Yeah.
We had a coup in the United States in 1963. And no matter what side of the assassination controversy you stand on, everyone, every historian, every person I've ever talked to agrees that the United States of America has gone downhill ever since November of 1963.
Can you just tell people, what was your conclusion originally when you wrote Crossfire about why John F. Kennedy was killed? And also, I wonder, was it the same interpretation that Oliver Stone used when he did JFK, which basically focused on Vietnam connection?
Yeah.
How did you look at it?
Let me back into that. I'll start with the Oliver Stone thing because I was pretty gratified by the Oliver Stone movie JFK, which I'll be the first to say is not necessarily ground truth, but it's closer to the truth than we've gotten so far. And I was also gratified in that it turns out that Oliver Stone did not just take my book, Crossfire, along with Jim Garrison's book on the trail of the assassins, and just run with it. He had his own research staff headed by Harvard graduate Jane Rasconi and a whole staff of people. And they went back and they backtracked on my book, Crossfire, and they even re-interviewed some of the people I'd interviewed, and they looked at the same information, documents I'd looked at, and lo and behold, they came to the same conclusion. I made my money option in the book, and I was fully prepared to repudiate that film if I thought that it deviated, sharply from my conclusions and what I came to know and believe about the assassination. But I didn't have to do that because they came to the same conclusion. Okay. So what is that? Okay. 25 words or less. John F. Kennedy really believed he was president, and he was taking steps that he thought was in the best interest of the public of this country. Right. Well, that put him at loggerheads with some of the most violent and corrupt organizations in our nation, and that would be organized crime, the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, certain elements and hawkish elements within the military, and the anti-Castro Cubans. And what we find is that they were all working together under Operation Mongoose, which was the secret war against Castro. And it involved elements of organized crime, the military, U.S. military, the FBI was well aware of what was going on. Some of them were even aiding in it. The CIA, and which was backing, funding, training, egging on the anti-Castro Cubans, up to and including assassination teams. Well, they simply sent one to Dallas. And then they picked this low-level U.S. intelligence operative, Lee Harvey Oswald, and blamed him for the crime. And it was easy enough to pull this off because they had cover from the absolute top, Common sense would tell you that you do not kill the President of the United States if there's even the slightest chance that his successor is going to hunt you down and prosecute you. Right. So Lyndon Johnson, although I doubt anybody will ever be able to prove that he initiated the assassination, he certainly went along with it. In fact, when you get down to it, if you want to get to a techno-legal conclusion of the assassination, I will name the two people that are guilty of the Kennedy assassination, and that is Lyndon Baines Johnson and his good old buddy and next-door neighbor, J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI. And how can I say that? Can I prove that those two men orchestrated or ordered the assassination? No, I cannot. But what I can prove, beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt, is that both of those men took steps and took actions that blocked and blunted any truthful investigation of what really happened to President Kennedy. Under our legal system, that makes them accessories after the fact. And in Texas, we have executed people who the facts of the case show did not pull the trigger, but they helped cover up the crime. They were accessories after the fact. Because under our legal system, if you shield, especially in a murder case, if you shield the murderer, if you hide the murderer, if you know about it and don't tell the authorities, you're an accessory, and if you're an accessory, you're considered as guilty as the person who pulled the trigger. So who was the grassy knoll gunman? Who cares? Because now we know that the real force behind the cover-up, the accessories of the crime, were Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover. And see, that's another thing. There has been no cover-up in the classic sense of a cover-up, meaning you can't get any information. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The cover-up in the Kennedy assassination is obfuscation. They have muddied the waters so much with claim and counterclaim, charge and countercharge, one expert versus another, that the average person just goes, oh, man, I don't want to hear any more about it.
This is too much. There are some Kennedy documents that are still being withheld. I remember reading about this not long ago.
Yes. And the National Archives, by the way, are dragging their feet on releasing any of them.
Yeah, and I recall a statement by the official spokesperson, whoever this guy is, and he said, well, yeah, but like 99% of the stuff is out there, so what are you people complaining about? And I'm just thinking, well, that might make that 1% really important.
And that's right. Maybe that 1% has that thank you note from Lyndon Johnson to Lee Oswald.
Exactly.
Now, I will say this. I doubt very seriously that there's any true smoking guns still laying in government files. For one thing, if there was such a document that was a smoking gun, it's been destroyed a long time ago or filed away somewhere like at Guantanamo, and probably in a file cabinet labeled Forestry Service or something. You'll never get to it. So probably any document that's out there either obliquely refers to information that would probably lend any thinking person to understand how they covered this whole thing up, or it's simply documents that shows what bunglers they are about so many things. And see, there's another thing. Lee Harvey Oswald, to the world, I say to the world because it was captured on sound and film, and it's still available. Anybody wants to go up on the internet, look for it. He's shouting to the newsman. He said, I didn't kill anybody. No, sir. I'm just a patsy. Mm-hmm. Well, being a patsy, that implies that he was set up to take the blame.
Right.
Now, what kills me is that you had the Warren Commission and you had the House Select Committee on Assassination, the Church Committee, and several other committee hearings. And not one of them ever said, well, he said he was just a patsy. Let's look and see if there's any evidence to support that. They never considered that maybe he was telling the truth. It was always he did it, and they cherry-picked the information that would only support the conclusion that Oswald was the lone assassin. And they let everything else go. For example, the Warren Commission just flat out came and said that they couldn't find any real evidence to connect Jack Ruby to organized crime.
Good grief.
Yeah, wait a minute.
Good grief.
All you got to do is go and read what we now know, and he was connected to some of the top people in organized crime. Now, are they that dumb? No, they're not. It was a coup d'etat.
Yeah. So what have you learned that you feel is particularly important and new that's going into this new book?
Well, there's a lot of new stuff. I think one of the things that cropped up as a result of the Assassination Records Review Board, which was created in the wake of the Oliver Stone movie, because there was such an outcry about all the documents that were still locked up. So the Congress committee created the JFK Act of 1992 and they created the Assassination Records Review Board, whose job was to go into government agencies and pull out, make public any record that had the slightest connection to the Kennedy assassination. And, God, there was some good stuff that came out. Unfortunately, they said, well, our mandate was simply to get all the records. We were not an investigation, and we were not called upon to make any conclusions. So they dumped it all in the National Archives, and it'll be years before journalists and historians can sift through all this stuff. But I can tell you there's some extraordinary things. One that I recall was a memo written by Gerald Ford, our only unelected president, and he served on the Warren Commission. And as they were writing their final report, he ordered them to change the wording from Kennedy was shot in the back to Kennedy was shot through the neck. Well, this allowed them to argue that the bullet went through Kennedy's neck, didn't strike any bone. It went on down and struck Connally and caused all the wounds to Connally. It's the single bullet, or better yet, the magic bullet theory. And it was all done because Gerald Ford ordered them to change the wording. Because the autopsy showed he was shot in the back, third thoracic vertebra, okay? Clearly.
But that would have made it impossible for the magic bullet theory to have any validity.
Exactly. Come on, folks.
Ford
Wake
was
up, smell the coffee. That gets back to, you were going to ask this question, so I'll get the jump on you.
Go.
And I hear this all the time. Will we ever know the truth about who killed Kennedy? Well, folks, that's not really the question that's being asked, because we know the truth right now if you'll study the evidence. And I've already run through that, okay? It's either a lone nut or it's not. Well, it's not. If it's not, it's a conspiracy. Then the conspiracy's been covered up at the level of the federal government. This turns it into a coup d'etat. So we know what happened to Kennedy, okay? And the whole complexion of this nation changed. So what you're really asking is going to be a time when some government official gets up and says, okay, at a big official press conference, here's what really happened to Kennedy. No. That is not going to happen. No politician is going to fade that heat. So you have to think for yourselves, folks. You got to do a little reading, got to go look at YouTube, got to look around, listen to both sides, and then think for yourself. Okay?
So where it's going is basically where we are at right now, is what I think you're saying.
Yes. But now it's kind of like what I'm finding out is my conclusion, which was there was a consensus reached among these violent factions in our country, approved at the very top by the Wall Street bankers and the moneyed elite that actually run the country, that Kennedy was a problem and therefore perhaps a danger, and he had to go. And yet they couldn't just simply raise money and vote him out, because waiting in the wings was his brother Robert, waiting behind him was his brother Teddy. Yeah. And there was already a lot of fear going around about a Kennedy dynasty, okay? So they had to stop it in its tracks. So they shot him in broad daylight. It was a public execution carried out for the same reason that we publicly execute criminals, to serve as a deterrent to anyone who would even consider following in his footsteps. And what was he doing that got him so angered? Well, you mentioned Vietnam. There was a National Security Action Memorandum signed on October the 11th, 1963, in which he said he agreed with the report that said we could get out of Vietnam and disengage and be out by the end of 1965. And in this document, he says, make no formal announcement, but begin the withdrawal of 1,000 military advisors. And at that time, there were only military advisors in Vietnam. It was only after Kennedy died, months later, when we had the phony Gulf of Tonkin incident, that Johnson used that as an excuse to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave him the power to bypass the Constitution and declare war, and he began to send ground combat troops into Vietnam.
That's right.
If Kennedy had lived, no ground combat troops, no Vietnam War, no 58,000 lost American lives, no wrecked economy, no schism between the ages and between families. Also, Robert would have continued his crime-busting efforts, and in the words of a Kennedy family member that I interviewed one time, he said if Kennedy had not been assassinated, he thinks they would have broken the back of organized crime in this country.
That's an incredible
No Vietnam War, no organized crime, probably an end to the Cold War, because Khrushchev and Kennedy had after the missile crisis, had developed kind of a mutual respect for each other, and they were both looking for ways to end the Cold War. This would have been a kinder, gentler, more peaceful nation.